İmam Mâtürîdî'nin Tanrı'nın varlığına dair delili nedir?
So thank you very much for having me today. So first, I'm going to provide a quick outline of Mataridi's argument for the existence of God, and I'm going to say why it is unusual. So in essence, Mataridi argues that the existence of conflict, contradiction, and even the existence of evil itself are actually evidence that God exists. Typically, we think of these things as evidence that God does not exist, or that God does not exist the way that we conceive of God. But for Mataridi, these are actually evidence for an all-powerful God, a God who is all-merciful, a God who is in constant connection with, control over God's creation. So for many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with Mataridi. He dies in 944. He lives in what's present-day Uzbekistan, the city of Samarkand. And briefly, his work is characterized by an interest in proving the basic doctrines of Islam, of Sunni Islam, using methods that are, in his mind, universally applicable or appeal to people no matter what their prior knowledge or prior faith standpoint is, or philosophical standpoint is. Because he argues famously in the beginning of his systematic treatise, his Kitab al-Tawhid, he famously has this great line where he says, there's one thing that all religions have in common. And the one thing they all have in common is that they are convinced that they are correct and that everyone else's religion is wrong. And they make this argument by saying that they have ancestors or reliable authorities that they follow. But they all say this. So how do we know who's correct? So he tries to elaborate in his theology a few methods for how people using their own reason and their own experience can understand and argue for his view of God and of religion. So there's two parts to the way I think about his distinctive proof for God. You could call it sort of almost like a proof from evil, or a proof from conflict, a proof from chaos, as opposed to its opposite, or as opposed to those things being seen as contrary to the existence of God. So how does he argue for this proof? There are two dimensions to this that I try to identify. First is epistemology, his philosophy of knowledge, and then metaphysics, how he thinks reality itself functions. So in terms of knowledge, he argues that our sensory experience of the world, interpreted by our reason and our intellect, is very reliable. And it gives us direct access to the way things really are. We actually can understand the truth of things, as he puts it frequently, using our immediate sense experience as interpreted by our reason or our intellect. This is his basic epistemological argument. But he argues that we have incomplete access to the truth of things. So we do have access to the truth of the world around us, but it's incomplete because while our senses are reliable, they're limited. We can't see everything at once. We can't experience everything at once. And not only that, but we frequently, our own biases interfere with our ability to correctly interpret the data. So as I go through these basic points of Mataridi's argument, I also want to note that I'm going to cite a few passages from his work, but I'm going to give you the page numbers from Bekir Topaloglu's famous translation that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It goes without saying that it's a wonderful, wonderful book. If you've not read it, please do, by the great Bekir Topaloglu. So I'll give you some page numbers, but they'll be keyed to that translation so that you can refer to those in this great Turkish translation. So he talks about on page 145 how we observe the world with our senses, and we see that everything in the world presents different aspects of itself to us, to our senses. So our senses see a single side or a single aspect of something when we perceive it. These include things like a thing's color or its taste or how it feels to us, how it sounds to us, etc. But he also says on page 241 that we can only see what's directly in front of us. We can only perceive what we have, what our senses can directly sort of look at. He constantly uses terms in Arabic that indicate sight. So he talks about physical senses in general, but he talks about them consistently using words that refer to sight or perception. So we perceive things directly, but again, we can only see what's right in front of us, what the aspect of things that presents itself to us on page 241. And on page 342 and 343, he mentions that not only are our senses limited by our capability to see only what's in front of us or perceive what we have direct access to, but we have our own biases. We make mistakes, or our minds are limited. So our own biases and our desires, our delusions can get in the way of our reason correctly interpreting the sense data that we are given. So again, his epistemology, his argument is that we do have direct access to reality. We can see it, we can perceive it through our senses directly, immediately, but it's limited. We never have the whole picture, and it's limited by our own biases that we have to try and constantly overcome. God, of course, is the contrast to all of this, who has perfect access, perfect knowledge, is completely objectively aware. And so our created nature is in contrast to God's nature in this respect, always. The second aspect of this, the metaphysical aspect of his argument, is that why is it the case that we only can see one aspect of a thing at a time? It's because of how our knowledge works, but also the aspects of things change constantly. And this is where he uses the term taqallub or flux, or it kind of means, like the way he uses it in the Arabic verb form, it kind of means like a constant turning over it again and again and again and again. So fluctuation in English. And so he constantly refers to things in the world as in a process of taqallub, of constantly turning over, of constantly shifting and changing, but in a very specific way. So we perceive things in their aspects. They're, again, color, sight, touch, taste, etc. But those aspects of things are not stable. They constantly change. He says in the very beginning of his text, right at the beginning of his treatise, he lays out this basic proof that I'm leading up to. It's on page 72 in Topolu's text, right at the beginning, where he says that, again, unlike God, nothing in the world, nothing in the created world has a single characteristic that's always stable. Everything we see, even from the smallest atom to the largest, most complex thing, even the smallest atom, it doesn't have a single stable characteristic that it always has. And he calls these characteristics natures in Arabic, oftentimes. And these natures of a thing are constantly changing. So one thing, as it changes from state to state, the famous kalam theology term, hell, from state to state, as a thing, as an atom, as an object, from smallest to biggest, whatever it is, as it goes from state to state, including the smallest, tiniest atoms, as they go from state to state, they're constantly changing their aspects. Their fundamental nature, their fundamental characteristic is always changing. So that also makes our perception of the world complicated. We can only see one aspect of a thing at a time. And also the aspect that we're seeing changes quickly based on our standpoint and based on the standpoint of the thing that we are perceiving. And he goes so he doesn't just limit this constant flux to physical characteristics. He includes in it abstract, very profound characteristics, even good and evil. And he specifically says that even good and evil of a thing change based on its state. So one single thing, and this again is on page 72 in the translation, right at the beginning of the treatise, even the same thing can be good or evil in different states, in different circumstances. And he gives a classic example, I'm not sure if it's here or elsewhere, but he gives a classic example of like a medicine, right? Many materials that are medicinal are poisonous in one context, but life-saving in the other. So everything in the universe is like this. It's constantly changing its state. It's constantly in flux. It's constantly experiencing this taqallub, a verb that he uses many, many times throughout his text. And if you're familiar with classical Arabic or theological terms in this genre, it's unusual. It's an odd word. He's doing it very deliberately. It's not a common term. So we're constantly confronted with a world that is constantly in flux. And from the smallest to the largest thing, does not exhibit a single stable nature or characteristic for us to perceive. It's changing all the time. And so he basically says, if you look around you, this is the world that you see. You see a world of alternation of good and evil, of light and dark, of things that make sense to you, things that don't make sense, of constant conflict and constant change, but not just like mutation or morphing, but a complete shift from one characteristic to the next, from good to evil, from light to dark, in the same thing. So a constant overturning, constant fluctuation. And he says, again, this is what our senses show us. And so this shows us what the world is actually like. How can this prove the existence of God? This seems like a world that, again, if anything, is not being operated by an all-powerful, all-loving creator. It seems like a world that's, frankly, in chaos. And what's also notable about his theology, I think, is that he's extremely honest. He doesn't basically say, well, evil's an illusion. If you look at it one way, he's like, no, it's real. I mean, things are bad and things are good. These are all real things. But he says the way to look at this is not to try and say evil is an illusion, but to say that look at it as a part of the structure of the universe and look at it this way. And so on page 57 to 59, again in the translation, he lays out this proof where he says, everything that you see in the world is combined, is a composition of these opposing and differing and contradictory natures. And these natures, say good or evil, their tendency is to repel one another. Good and evil cannot exist. They're complete perfect opposites. They should not be able to be together. The way I think about this, and he uses the language of repelling. So it's kind of like two magnets, and I don't know how magnets work, to be honest, but like, you know, the magnets that are the, I guess, reversed or the same polarity or whatever, you put them together and they push apart. Everything in the world is composed of magnets like that. These natures that should be completely pushing each other apart. Good and evil should not be able to adhere in the same thing ever, let alone over and over and over again. So he says, if you look at the world, it's kind of like a big complex phenomenon with all these magnets that are somehow suspended together, but they should logically and metaphysically, they should be constantly falling apart. They should be there should be complete dissolution. Everything should be constantly collapsing. But he says it's not. Good and evil, big and large, beauty and ugliness, light and dark, all of these things exist together, but they keep existing, and they keep existing in the same thing over and over and over again. So he says the fact that things do that, that proves that there is something, to use a phrase, holding it all together very deliberately, making it all operate, putting it all in harmony, or not really harmony, putting it all together in one motion so that it all works together, and that is God. And one way to think about this is even the stronger the contrast between good and evil, the stronger the proof for God, because the more likely it should be that something is so good or so evil that good and evil push each other apart. So the stronger contrast, the more severe difference you see in the world between good and evil, that in fact is proof for God, because it proves God is holding these two things together. God is keeping them together in one thing, in one experience, in one object, in one world. So he basically says that all of the material that we are accustomed to thinking about as proof that there is no God, the fact that there is evil, the fact that things are constantly changing, there's no fixity, there's very little predictability. The world changes so quickly, it doesn't always change in our favor, to put it mildly. He says that not only are these things proof that there is a God holding it all together, but even the strongest contrast is a stronger proof, because it means that it takes more knowledge, more will to hold these things together. So he basically says that the more severe the contradiction you see in the world, this is even more proof for how God is all-knowing, all-powerful, all-merciful, all-compassionate, all-loving, has complete care and devotion to the world and complete power over the world, because the stronger the contrast between what we see in the world, the more you would need an infinitely powerful being to hold it all together, to keep it all going. So he basically wants us to shift our perception, say, don't think about light and dark, good and evil, conflict, contradiction in your experience. First of all, it's real. Your senses show it to you, it's real. Second of all, it's not proof that God isn't there, but even the strongest contrast that you see is proof that God is there, because how else could the world keep going with these contradictions, these repelling natures, constantly inhering in it and constantly existing in the same thing from one moment to the next? So on page 162, he also says this argument again. This is his basic proof for God, and many scholars have talked about this. But one point about Maturidi's works that his commentators have made from the very beginning is that his language is very obscure. It's very difficult. His Arabic is very complicated. And so this is a proof that he uses constantly, but is sometimes hard to interpret. And the way I look at this proof is that he is trying to signal to us that the world that we see is full of contradiction, not just complexity, not just mysteriousness, but contradiction, outright things that simply should not be there in our mind. Evil is real, good is real, light is real, dark is real. But once you accept that and you see that those two things, down to the smallest atom, those two things change all the time, they should not be able to change. They should not be able to be in the same thing. That proves that there is a God holding these things together, keeping the world together, keeping it going. And again, the word that he uses to refer specifically to the phenomenon of things, their natures constantly overturning, constantly becoming their contradiction, constantly becoming their opposite, that word is takhalub, is flux. He constantly refers to the world as in flux, its nature constantly turning over, something becoming good and then evil, something becoming light and then dark, etc. Finally, on page 338 in the translation, which is a great section in general because it sort of summarizes a lot of his theology as a whole. It's kind of a self-contained treatise in the middle of the larger treatise. He says that all of God's creation fluctuates, takhallaba, all of God's creation fluctuates within and through God's gifts and God's goodness. So not only is this proof for God's power, for God's existence, it's proof of God's goodness and proof of God's care for creation, because all that is good about our experience, all that we need to live, all that keeps us going is provided by God in spite of and in combination with things that are bad, right? The medicine that kills you, or the substance that can kill you, is precisely the thing that can save your life. And so Mataridi sees in this contradiction not a challenge to God's existence, but in fact a proof of it. He sees that the constant ability for the world to become its opposite, for something to become good and then to become evil, to fluctuate like that, he sees it as proof, in fact, for God. And that's his basic argument, that again, just to summarize very quickly and close things out, your senses perceive things directly, but in a limited way, and you can perceive that even the smallest thing in the world can be its opposite. It can be good or it can be evil from one moment to the next. But yet somehow things keep going. Things persist. The structure still holds and still develops and still produces wonder and beauty and amazing things and produces us. And so because that structure has its most basic components, can change from good to evil, light to dark immediately from one moment to the next, but the structure still exists, like two magnets somehow holding together that should be repelling each other apart. Because the structure still exists, there is a God there maintaining the structure, operating the structure according to God's will and according to God's eternal wisdom, as Mataridi is famous for also emphasizing. That's his proof, and I appreciate your attention, and thank you for having me on again today.